So manageable learning is, I think the first principle is that we have tried not to overload learners with too much language, be it vocabulary or grammar. By the same token, we have also had access to English Profile, and this means that we've been able to look very carefully at the kinds of words that learners can use at a specific level. And this is what English Profile does and is a useful tool for. It indicates that at, say, B1 level, learners can produce these grammar items or they can produce these vocabulary items. So we've been able to cross-reference our syllabus with English Profile. So that helps us enormously because it means that we don't try and include language that's too difficult or too complex in any way, in terms of vocabulary, but also in terms of grammar.
For example, the reading texts were taken from real sources, but especially at lower levels, they were simplified so that the language content reflected the level of the profile. So I think we had something like 90% of the words were at the level and only 10% above that level. In the case of texts, one thing it guarantees is that teachers and learners don't fall into traps. I think it often happens when using authentic texts, especially if the teacher doesn't have time to prepare very much for the lesson, then he or she suddenly finds that there are all kinds of stray words and phrases which bog the lesson down and which have to be dealt with. So by pre-selecting the language in this way, it makes the learning more manageable. It makes sure that things go relatively smoothly, learners aren't confronted with language which is wildly above their level. And very often there's a temptation to teach very long lists of words, very long sets of words. And if learners sense that some of these are above their level, then probably they won't bother to learn them. And so in a sense it's a waste of time. They just clutter up the learning process. This relates in fact quite closely to Stephen Krashen's idea of what he called I+1. In other words, that learners are most likely to acquire language efficiently if the input is just above the level they already know, but not too far above it. And this is an idea which is talked about very often, but isn't often applied. And Cambridge English in Power does, in fact, it applies this idea. This is exactly what happens in the lessons. The learners are exposed to language at and just above their level. So I think this is very significant because it means that learners learn not only more easily, but also they acquire language more efficiently.
The other thing is that obviously learners want to be able to use language which is similar to the language that native speakers are using, because obviously they want to use current English, natural English. So the broader Cambridge corpus is really, really useful for that because we can look at the corpus and find out how native speakers use language, and we can include those kinds of examples in the book. So it means that we're not including language which is irrelevant, not